The third section of the Hebrew Bible, called the Ketuvim, or writings, includes several books that scholars typically classify together as wisdom literature. Works of wisdom literature survive from Egypt and the Mesopotamian cultures as well. It's not too far wrong to think of wisdom literature as a kind of moral philosophy, but using the term wisdom literature helps to remind us that this literature comes from Egypt, the Levant, and Mesopotamia rather than Greece, and more importantly, it preserves one of the key words or concepts found in the biblical wisdom literature itself. Now, the book of Proverbs represents a type of wisdom book that compiles individual sayings into larger collections. Wisdom that comes packaged in little sayings or aphorisms, as in the book of Proverbs, is called gnomic wisdom. Now, gnomic wisdom doesn't really have anything to do with garden variety gnomes, but perhaps the compact stature of a garden gnome can help you connect the term gnomic wisdom to wisdom that comes in small packages. Actually, the term gnomic derives from a Greek word for knowledge, so you could think of gnomic wisdom as wisdom that helps you know things. The biblical writers knew of other types of wisdom as well, such as practical wisdom or vocational skill, and mantic wisdom, or the ability to interpret symbolic discourses like dreams and visions. But in this video, we're focusing on the book of Proverbs, and hence on gnomic wisdom. Now, by definition, the form of gnomic wisdom is short, pithy sayings or aphorisms. In the Bible, individual bits of gnomic wisdom are usually expressed in parallelistic couplets. Larger structures are possible in biblical wisdom literature, but these lie outside the scope of this particular video. If you don't know what a parallelistic couplet is, you might want to watch my video on parallelism in biblical Hebrew poetry. The content of gnomic wisdom in the Bible is advice and observations about any aspect of everyday life. Open your Bible to any random page in Proverbs 10 through 29 and just start reading the sayings listed there. You'll find sayings that deal with charity, with parenting, anger management, industriousness, alcohol consumption, business ethics, speech, and a variety of other topics. The goal of biblical gnomic wisdom is to help people live the good life as the biblical sages understand it. The biblical sages stress the practical benefits of wisdom as a reason to get their students to acquire wisdom. The biblical sages constantly encourage their students, whom you should think of as young Israelite or Judean men, to acquire wisdom because it will be good for them. Among the sayings that give advice and observations about specific life situations, we also find general summary statements about the value of wisdom and righteousness. For example, Proverbs 12:21 reads, "No harm happens to the righteous, but the wicked are filled with trouble." And Proverbs 14:14 reads, "The perverse get what their ways deserve, and the good what their deeds deserve." Those statements seem to express a pretty strong version of what you might call retribution theology. But we need to dig just a little deeper to appreciate the sage's outlook on this. Retribution theology is usually associated with the idea of a covenant between God and Israel. Deuteronomy 11:26-28 is typical. "See, I am setting before you today a blessing and a curse. The blessing if you obey the commandments of the Lord your God that I am commanding you today, and the curse if you do not obey the commandments of the Lord your God, but turn from the way that I am commanding you today to follow other gods that you have not known." In Deuteronomy and other parts of the Bible, retributive theology means the idea that God will punish the Israelites if they break their covenant with God, and that God will reward them if they keep that covenant. Proverbs, however, doesn't emphasize law and covenant in this way. The word law does come up in the book of Proverbs, but not God's law specifically, at least in most cases. Some of the sayings in Proverbs do encourage obedience to commandments, but again, that's usually the sage's commandments, not God's commandments, that are in view. And the book of Proverbs only mentions a covenant once, with reference to wedding vows. This doesn't mean that biblical sages are non-religious. God is mentioned almost 100 times in the book of Proverbs, but the sages think about God's relationship with people in a different, non-covenantal way. So instead of talking about Proverbs having a theology of retribution based on covenant, like Deuteronomy, we do better to think of Proverbs having a theology of moral cause and effect based on creation. Proverbs 8:22-36 depicts personified wisdom as God's first creation, or firstborn daughter, as present with God for the creation of everything else, functioning either as a cheerleader or perhaps as a contractor, depending on how a certain verb in verse 30 is translated. Pause this video for a moment and read Proverbs 30:22-36 for yourself to see what I mean. Did you notice the results of wisdom's connections with creation, as described by wisdom herself, personified in Proverbs 8:32-36? Because wisdom was the first of God's creations and was present for the rest of creation, wisdom says, she is able to instruct people about the way the world works. And the biblical sages want to know how the world works, and they want to share their knowledge with their children and their students. Their own wisdom, a reflection of personified wisdom, leads them to believe that the created order includes an inherent system of causes and effects, similar to what we might call the laws of physics, but operating in the moral and social spheres as well as the physical sphere. Superficially, this resembles Deuteronomy's retribution theology, but it's grounded in a broader, more universal view of God's relationship to the world.